Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's a very clear expectation of boundaries.
Oh,
It's
sure.
a bit like engineering, I mean. You break your arm, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the film,
Yeah.
and the doctor just points and says, there it is.
It's binary. It's either broken or not broken. You get a clean, visible distinction.
Yeah, and it's comforting. We really like things to be visible, to be, well, neatly categorized.
We want to know where one thing ends and another begins.
Yes. But then you step into the world of theology, specifically when dealing with the nature of God entering human history, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just broken.
Yeah, it doesn't work anymore.
We're looking at a landscape that challenges all of our standard categories of measurement. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are thrilled you're joining us today.
Glad you're here.
Today's mission is an exhaustive exploration of the main ideas and proposals found in Part 2 of Joseph Ratzinger's landmark book, Introduction to Christianity. Specifically, we are looking at the section titled Part 2, Jesus Christ.
And just to set the stage for you, this deep dive is going to focus strictly on Ratzinger's own words and his theological arguments regarding who Jesus is.
Now, we aren't adding outside material or, trying to psychoanalyze the 1960s cultural upheaval he was writing in.
No psychology of the moment here.
Right to the text. We are going to look at complex, incredibly dense concepts like the unity of the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith.
As well as the revolutionary Christian definition of person and the principle of vicarious representation.
It's a lot to unpack. But Ratzinger is addressing a profound tension here.
He really is. He's asking us to look at the second article of the Apostles' Creed.
That's the section concerning Jesus Christ, yeah.
Yes, and he acknowledges right away that this is where the modern mind just hits a wall.
I want to focus on that wall for a second, because the challenge Ratzinger frames is, it's difficult to process. How does a modern mind accept that the ultimate meaning of all reality is tied to one specific historical person who lived in Palestine 2,000 years ago?
It's a tough pill to swallow.
Think about it this way. Imagine being told that the formula for gravity is not, a mathematical equation that applies everywhere equally.
Okay.
Instead, you're told that gravity is actually a living, breathing person.
Oh.
And if you want to understand gravity, you can't just study physics in a lab. You literally have to look at the face of this one specific individual.
That analogy captures the tension perfectly. It is an inherent scandal, and Ratzinger does not shy away from that word.
He calls it a scandal.
He does. He identifies this as the biggest hurdle for the modern reader. He calls it the alliance of logos and sarks.
Okay, let's define those terms for clarity so you can follow along.
Yeah.
Logos translates roughly from the Greek as the underlying meaning, the truth, or the word.
Yes.
And sarx means flesh.
Correct. So the modern mind, much like the ancient philosophical mind, can easily accept logos.
Because it's abstract.
Yeah. We can accept that there's an underlying order to things, a mathematical elegance or a meaning that sustains all being. We can accept the God of the philosophers an overarching, unmoving first cause.
Sure, a distant creator makes logical sense.
But the Christian creed makes a claim that disrupts all of that. It asserts that this universal meaning, this logos, became sarx.
It became flesh.
It became flesh. The meaning of all being is no longer just found in the sweep of the mind rising above the individual into, the universal realm of ideas.
It's grounded.
It is. Instead, the meaning of all reality is located in the midst of time, in the countenance of one single man.
It sounds, honestly, it sounds presumptuous. Ratzinger notes how foolish it appears to assert that a single historical figure, an individual executed by the Roman Empire around AD 30, is the authoritative center of all history.
It feels very limiting, doesn't it?
Yeah. If I'm a historian or a philosopher looking for universal truths, I want concepts that transcend time, not a specific person who lived and died in a very specific, limited cultural context.
And because this alliance of logos and sarks is so difficult to accept, modern theology has spent an enormous amount of energy trying to dismantle it.
Trying to break the two apart.
Yes. Ratzinger critiques what he calls the modern theological shuttle movement.
Shuttle, back and forth.
Yeah. This is the attempt to separate the historical Jesus from the Christ of faith.
Oh, I've seen this dynamic play out. You see it in, popular documentaries and articles all the time.
All the time.
On one side, you have the search for the historical Jesus. And the goal there seems to be stripping away all the miracles, the resurrection, the claims of divinity, just to find the regular guy underneath.
They want to reduce him to a wise man.
Yeah, a moral teacher or maybe a political revolutionary.
That is one end of the shuttle, and on the other end you have the Christ of faith.
Okay, so who is on that end?
Well, the thinkers who isolate the historical Jesus often dismiss the Christ of faith as a mythological or purely spiritual construct, something created by the early church.
Ah, I see. So they argue that the early Christian community basically invented a divine figure to cope with the trauma of their leader's execution.
Yes, that is the argument. They want to sever the two entirely. You either get the dusty historical rabbi, or you get the ethereal mythological Christ.
But Ratzinger says this is a false dilemma. You can't just pick one and discard the other.
He insists you cannot untangle them. The one cannot exist without the other.
So they are bound together.
In reality, Jesus only subsists as the Christ, and the Christ only subsists in the shape of Jesus.
Interesting.
He argues that instead of trying to reconstruct an artificial historical figure devoid of divinity, we just have to simply try to understand what the Christian faith actually states about this unity.
Okay, but why is it impossible to just view him as a great moral teacher? I mean, we do that with plenty of other historical figures. Ratzinger uses a specific contrast here, bringing up figures like Buddha or Socrates.
It's a really striking comparison. Buddha and Socrates direct the attention of their disciples away from themselves.
Away from themselves.
Yeah. Their own persons don't matter as much as the path they've pointed out. Socrates points to the pursuit of philosophical truth. Buddha points to the path of enlightenment.
Okay, I follow.
If you find the path of enlightenment, or if you grasp the philosophical truth, you can effectively forget the teacher. The teacher is just a signpost.
Right, well, I mean, the signpost doesn't matter once you reach the destination.
Yeah.
You don't sit and stare at the sign, you keep walking.
Yes. But Jesus says, I am the way. He doesn't just point to a path. His person is the message. You cannot separate the teachings of Jesus from the person of Jesus.
Oh, I get it. If a philosopher says, the unexamined life is not worth living, the truth of that statement stands completely independent of who said it.
Anyone could have said it.
Yeah. But if someone says, I am the bread of life, or I am the light of the world, the entire validity of the statement rests on the identity of the person speaking.
He is the way, and there is no way that is independent of him, because the real message he brings is not a doctrine, but his very person.
It's deeply personal.
Very much so. And Ratzinger points out that this I of Jesus refers entirely to the thou of the Father, meaning he is not self-sufficient in the closed-off sense, but he is truly a way.
But if his person is the message, how did the early believers first realize this?
It wasn't obvious immediately.
Yeah, did they just listen to his sermons and slowly put the pieces together? Or was there, like, a specific catalyst that forced them to realize they couldn't separate the man from the message?
That question takes us directly into how the early Christians actually understood Jesus, beginning with the evolution of the very title, Christ.
Let's trace that evolution then. We're talking about the identity of person and work. The word Christ wasn't his last name.
No, it wasn't. Christ is the Greek translation of the Hebrew word for Messiah, meaning the anointed one.
So it was a title.
Originally, yes, it was a title. It was a job description in a sense.
Yeah.
The Jewish people were waiting for the Messiah. But Ratzinger explains that the early Christian community at Rome,
The same community that formulated the creed.
yes, that community, they fused this title so completely with Jesus that it became a proper name.
So it went from being Jesus who fulfills the role of the Christ to just Jesus Christ.
The title and the man became one indivisible reality.
They lock them together.
This fusion is the basis of what Ratzinger calls functional Christology.
Functional Christology. That sounds a bit technical.
It does, but it just means that Jesus' entire being is a function of his work for us, but that function is his entire being. There's no private I in Jesus that sits back and takes a break from his mission.
Okay, I want to use an analogy to try and ground this for you. Think of a typical artist, maybe a painter.
Okay.
You can look at their canvas and evaluate the art completely separate from the artist's personal life. The artist paints the picture, puts down the brush, and goes home.
They step away from the work?
Yeah. At home, they might be a parent, a terrible cook, or, I don't know, a jazz enthusiast. Their identity is not solely encompassed by the act of painting.
Ratzinger is saying Jesus is the exact opposite of that dynamic. Jesus didn't just leave behind a body of teaching or a set of moral guidelines separate from his I.
So he didn't just paint a picture and walk away.
No. The artist, the brush, and the painting are entirely one entity here. His work is not something he does. It is who he is.
Well, but I mean, if someone is entirely defined by their work, in modern terms, we might just call them a workaholic who lacks boundaries.
That's a common modern interpretation.
How is Ratzinger's concept different from just being entirely consumed by a task?
Because a workaholic is still a separate subject performing an objectified task. A workaholic can still theoretically stop working, even if they choose not to.
They still have a separate self.
Yes. With Jesus, his I and his word are indistinguishable. He is the word. As Ratzinger notes, Jesus didn't perform a work that could be distinguished from his I and depicted separately.
Wow.
He has identified himself so closely with his word that he is word. His work is the unreserved giving of himself.
Which means Christian faith cannot merely be the acceptance of a philosophical system.
No, it can't.
Because if I agree with a philosophy, I just adopt a set of ideas. I can hold the ideas without caring about the philosopher.
But faith, in this context, is a personal faith. It's the acceptance of a person who has completely identified himself with his mission.
You're accepting the person, not just a list of rules.
It is the acceptance of the word as person and the person as word. You aren't assenting to a list of moral demands. You are encountering a reality where the messenger and the message are identical.
Okay, but if Jesus' identity and his mission are one and the same, where did this become undeniably clear to his followers?
It wasn't during the sermons on the hillside.
It seems like a realization that would require a really huge shift in perspective. And Ratzinger points directly to the cross as the birthplace of this specific realization, doesn't he?
He does, and this leads us to a fascinating historical detail that Ratzinger emphasizes deeply. During his public ministry, Jesus didn't directly and unequivocally proclaim himself as the Messiah to the general public.
He didn't.
No, he was actually quite reticent about it, often telling people to keep his miracles quiet.
Which is really counterintuitive to how we often picture the gospel narratives today. We tend to imagine him walking around Palestine announcing his messianic status to anyone who would listen.
Yet Ratzinger points out that the man who formally and publicly gave him this title was Pontius Pilate.
Pilate, the Roman governor.
Yes, Pilate wrote it on the execution notice, the titulus placed on the cross. He proclaimed Jesus in all the international languages of the day as the executed King of the Jews, the Messiah.
The execution notice.
Right.
The literal death sentence of history becomes the very first public profession of faith.
The irony is incredibly deep there.
The Roman Empire, in an attempt to mock a conquered people and display their absolute dominance, accidentally broadcast the central tenet of the Christian religion to the world.
It is a paradoxical unity. Ratzinger states that the crucifixion is his coronation.
His coronation.
Yes. His kingship is defined not by dominance or military victory, but by his total surrender of himself to men. His existence is his word, and he is word because he is love.
Let's trace how the early Christians processed this. If I'm a follower of Jesus in the first century, and I see my leader executed as a state criminal, my first instinct is that the mission has failed.
Naturally, you'd think it was over.
Yeah, the movement is done. So how did they get from that despair to seeing the cross as a coronation?
Ratzinger describes a two-step process of early faith. First, they looked at the cross. They looked at the execution and realized that his crucified I said everything.
In what way?
In the yielding up of his existence, he demonstrated that he is love, and therefore he is the truth, the logos. The total self-giving on the cross was the ultimate manifestation of his work, which, as we establish, is his person.
Oh, I see. So they realized the death wasn't a failure of the mission, it was the mission.
Yes. And the second step was retrospective.
Looking back.
Well, having understood his identity through the lens of the cross, the community looked back at his teachings and his life.
And what did they see?
They saw that the exact same total self-giving they witnessed on the cross was reflected in his words. The Sermon on the Mount, the parables, the healings, all of it made sense in the light of the crucifixion.
It recontextualized everything.
His message, studied retrospectively, always leads to and flows into this I, into the identity of word and person.
But this completely redefines what kingship or power means. It turns our standard definitions upside down.
Completely.
Usually power is demonstrated by how much control you have over others or, how much suffering you can inflict to maintain order. If true power is demonstrated as total powerlessness and self-surrender on a cross, what does that mean for his identity as God?
This brings us to a crucial philosophical revolution described in the text. We have to address a fundamental question Ratzinger poses. If this man is completely open, all word, all son, all for others, must he not be identical with God, who is love?
And this leads us into Ratzinger's deep dive into the term person. The word itself has a fascinating history. It comes from the Greek word prosopon, right? Well, I mean, the original Greek.
Yes, prosopon, which originally meant a theatrical mask used by actors on a stage.
A mask. So Christianity took this term, which denoted a role someone was playing, and completely revolutionized its meaning.
To really grasp this revolution, we have to understand the philosophical landscape of the ancient world. In ancient Greek philosophy, particularly following Aristotle, reality was divided into two main categories: substance and accidents.
Okay, we need to break those categories down carefully because they are foundational to understanding the shift Ratzinger is talking about.
Sure. Substance was the real thing. It was the core, independent reality of an object that stands on its own.
Okay.
An accident was merely a circumstantial feature, something secondary, like a color, a size, or a location.
Give me an example of that.
Take a piece of wood. The wood itself is the substance. Whether that wood is painted red or blue, whether it is carved into a chair or a table, those are accidents.
Oh, because the wood is still wood, regardless of the paint.
Yes. They modify the substance, but they are not the core reality.
In this framework, where does relation fit in? If I am a father or a friend or a son, are those relationships my substance or my accidents?
In ancient philosophy, relation was considered an accident.
Really?
An accident?
Yes. Being related to something else was secondary to simply existing as an independent substance. An individual human being would be a substance, standing alone. Their relationships with others would be secondary to their core, isolated reality.
I mean, that makes sense from a purely observational standpoint. I exist whether I'm talking to you or not. My existence seems primary, and our interaction seems secondary.
But Christian dogma, specifically the doctrine of the Trinity una essentia, tres personae, one essence in three persons, shattered this ancient division.
It broke the mold.
It did. Christian thought revealed that in God, relation is not an accident. In God, relations is an equally valid primordial mode of reality alongside substance. And Ratzinger calls this Trinitarian ontology, ontology being the study of being, of what things actually are.
When we say God is a trinity of persons, we're saying that God is pure relation. The first person, the Father, doesn't beget the Son as if the act of begetting were an afterthought or an accidental property added to a finished person.
It's not something he just decides to do later.
No, the first person is the act of begetting, of giving oneself. As Ratzinger quotes Augustine, "In God there are no accidents, only substance and relation."
Let's apply this to Jesus. Ratzinger uses a specific phrase from the Gospel of John to illustrate this. Mine is not mine. That's John 7:16.
Yes, a very powerful verse.
Jesus is saying that his teaching is not his own, but comes from the one who sent him. Ratzinger applies this to show that the Son has no fenced-off private I.
The Son's entire being is derived from the thou of the Father and lived for the you of men. He is pure relation.
Pure relation.
And because he is pure relation, he is pure unity. He doesn't cling to himself. There's no part of Jesus that is holding back, observing from a distance, or protecting his own ego.
This is incredibly counterintuitive to the modern mind. Today, we view a person as an isolated, independent individual. We define ourselves by our boundaries, by our autonomy, by what makes us distinct and separate from everyone else.
We value our independence above all else.
We do. We spend our lives building walls to protect our core substance. But Ratzinger argues the exact opposite. True personhood is pure, unreserved openness to the other.
The revolution is that relation stands beside substance as an equally primordial form of being. A person is not an isolated atom. A person is a being in relation. And Jesus embodies this perfectly.
He is the complete relinquishment of the isolated ego.
Yes.
But if true personhood is pure openness, does that mean our modern pursuit of radical independence is actually making us less human?
According to this theological framework, yes. The more we isolate ourselves into guarded substances, the further we move from the reality of personhood as revealed in God.
Wow, okay, but if Jesus' pure relation makes him God because he is completely transparent to the Father, how does this relate to his humanity?
That's the next big question Ratzinger tackles.
If he's God because he's pure relation, is he also human because of this? We usually think of divinity and humanity as opposing forces, like the more divine something is, the less human it must be.
Ratzinger answers this by addressing the flip side of the question. Is it permissible to view Christology as radical humanism?
And his answer?
His answer is a definitive yes.
I want to explore that term, radical humanism. By being entirely open, Jesus is presented as the ultimate exemplary man, The Apostle Paul calls him the last Adam.
Ratzinger lays out a fundamental anthropological rule here, anthropology being the study of humanity.
Good.
The rule is that a human being only truly comes to himself by moving away from himself and being with the other.
We only find ourselves by giving ourselves away. What's a paradox?
You only come to yourself through the other and through being with the other. If you grasp at your own identity, you lose it. If you pour yourself out, you discover who you truly are.
And Jesus does this perfectly.
Because Jesus perfectly embodies this outward movement, because he has no reserved area of a mere I, he oversteps the normal, restricted bounds of humanity as we experience it.
He pushes the definition of humanity past its breaking point. We are usually bound by self-preservation, fear, and ego. He operates completely without those limiters.
And by overstepping those bounds, he fulfills the very concept of what a human being is meant to be. He is the most human of men because he is the one who, in losing himself, has found himself.
He's the blueprint.
He's the exemplary man because he exists entirely for others. He is the blueprint for what humanity was designed to look like.
Okay, but if Jesus shows us that true humanity is existing completely for others, how does this actually play out in the mechanics of salvation?
How does it help us, you mean?
Yeah, how does his openness affect the rest of humanity? It's one thing to be an exemplar, a model. I can look at a great athlete and acknowledge they are the exemplary form of physical fitness, but their fitness doesn't make me healthy.
Merely observing them doesn't change your physical state.
No. So how does his openness actually save anyone else?
This brings us to the operational heart of Ratzinger's theology in this section. The concept of vicarious representation, or in German, Stellvertretung.
Stellvertretung.
This is the mechanism of how Christ's identity translates into salvation for humanity.
Let's define this concept carefully. As Ratzinger notes, it is central to understanding the entire Christian framework. The basic law of Christian existence is expressed in the simple preposition for.
Pro-existence, existing for another.
Existing for another.
Ratzinger explains the dynamic of the few and the many throughout salvation history. Salvation history operates through an unequal exchange where God uses the few, or ultimately the one, to save the many.
We see this pattern frequently in the biblical text, don't we?
You see it in the selection of a single people, Israel, for the sake of the nations. You see it in figures like Moses, who suffers vicariously for the people in the desert.
Or the concept of the suffering servant in Isaiah.
Well, yes, the servant who takes on the burden of the many. The pattern culminates in Jesus Christ, the one who exists for all humanity.
You know, and when people hear terms like vicarious representation or substitution, it can sound mechanical or even unjust.
It can sound like a transaction.
Yeah, like a rigid system where one person is punished so another goes free and human agency is just erased. It sounds like a courtroom loophole.
Ratzinger clarifies that this is not an abstract, terrifying predestination where an isolated creature is pitted against an absolute God.
It's not a courtroom drama.
Nor is it a magical, passive substitution where humans have no agency or choice, like a ledger being balanced in heaven while we sit passively on earth.
How does it function then? If it's not a courtroom loophole, what is the actual dynamic?
Christ takes on humanity's burden, humanity's sin, isolation, and distance from God. In this exchange, because his eye is completely open and without boundaries, he creates an inclusive system.
An inclusive system.
His existence for you breaks down the wall of his isolated existence, and in doing so, he draws all into the unity of his new being. It is a system that invites and requires free human participation.
So he opens the door, but we still have to walk through it.
The believer is called to participate in the same law of pro-existence. To be a Christian means living not for oneself, but receiving this basic law of action and living for others. You enter into the space he opened by adopting his mode of being.
Ratzinger points to the Eucharist and the cross as the ultimate manifestations of this existence for you.
They're the central expressions of this reality. In the Eucharist, the existence of Jesus Christ is explicitly explained as existence for the many. For you.
The physical embodiment of it.
The act of taking, blessing, breaking, and giving is the physical embodiment of a life poured out. It makes possible the communication of all people with one another through communication in him.
This mechanism of salvation also reveals what Ratzinger calls the law of disguise.
Ah, yes. This is a profound observation about how God operates in history. God manifests his greatness through littleness and hiddenness.
It's a complete inversion of human expectations of power.
It really is.
He traces this descent, this disguise, geographically and historically. From the entirety of the earth, God chooses the small, often conquered nation of Israel.
Not a global empire.
No. And within Israel, he doesn't choose the center of power, Jerusalem, but the obscure rural town of Nazareth.
A place of no political importance.
And from Nazareth, he proceeds to the total powerlessness and degradation of the cross.
In this sequence, earth to Israel to Nazareth to the cross, God seems to keep disappearing more and more. He becomes smaller, less significant in the eyes of the world.
He hides himself.
Yet Ratzinger argues that precisely in this way, God becomes more and more manifest as himself. Because God's true nature is love, and love is total self-giving, the highest power is revealed in the final degree of powerlessness.
It requires a complete reorientation of how we measure success, power, and significance. The ultimate meaning of all reality, the logos, chose to disguise itself in vulnerability.
And that vulnerability, that total openness to the other without holding anything back, is the mechanism that allows the one to stand in for the many, creating the inclusive space for humanity to enter into relationship with God.
To summarize our journey through Part 2 of Introduction to Christianity, we've covered a vast theological landscape today.
We really have.
We explored Ratzinger's firm refusal to split the historical Jesus from the Christ of faith. He demonstrated that the person and the work are inextricably bound together. You cannot have a teacher whose message is distinct from his identity when his identity is the message.
We examine the revelation of the cross as the very birthplace of belief, where Pilate's execution notice paradoxically became the first profession of faith, and where the crucifixion was revealed as a coronation of self-giving love.
We discussed the profound philosophical redefinition of the word person. Christianity moved the concept away from an isolated substance, a walled-off individual, to a reality of pure relation and total openness, exemplified by the Son whose mine is not mine.
And finally, we unpacked the fundamental law of proexistence, the principle of vicarious representation. We saw how the one exists for the salvation of the many, inviting all of humanity to participate in that same outward-facing reality through the mechanisms of the cross and the Eucharist.
Thank you for joining this deep dive into the source material.